That beautiful land, that beautiful state, it's a hellhole right now. And the Somalians should be out of here.
Somalis have always seen themselves as the fabric of this nation.
Let's show everybody what America is about. And America looks like this.
I've always said on this channel, immigration and multiculturalism by default aren't good. Americans, perhaps finally recognizing this, are now seeing entire cities transform into ethnic enclaves with people and cultures that are not only incompatible, but a significant drain on the taxpayer. In this video, I'm going to walk through what Somali immigration has actually meant for America. Somali immigration to the United States really began in the early 1990s after Somalia collapsed into civil war. Under President George Bush and then continued under Clinton, the US opened its refugee doors and started bringing in large numbers of Somali families who had been displaced across East Africa. Smaller groups had trickled in before, but the 90s were the first real wave. And like most migrant groups, they didn't spread out evenly, they clustered. Minnesota became the center of gravity, which today has close to 100,000 Somali residents and whole neighborhoods nicknamed Little Mogadishu. From the start, this wasn't a light sprinkling of new arrivals across America. It was a concentrated, rapidly growing immigrant bloc built through refugee programs and chain migration. One that would end up shaping entire neighborhoods for decades. And once these communities were established, the next question was simple. How well did they actually integrate into the economy? When you look at the numbers, the picture isn't comforting. Let's start with income. The median Somali household in Minnesota earned somewhere around $38,000 to $44,000 a year, depending on the data set. That's less than half the US median and far below Minnesota's state median. And this isn't just a temporary first few years in America type thing. Even after decades, the numbers barely move. Around 36 to 40% of Somalis in Minnesota still live below the poverty line, roughly 3 to 4 times the statewide poverty rate. To put that into perspective, the Hmong refugee community, which also arrived with low education and trauma from war, has now reduced its poverty rate to just below the Minnesota average. The Somali community has not followed that same upward trajectory. Employment tells the same story. US national numbers specific to Somali-born workers aren't broken out clearly, but Minnesota and European data give a stark picture. In the early 2000s, even community leaders in Minneapolis admitted that Somali women were almost entirely out of the workforce, and many men struggled to find stable work because of language barriers, low formal education, and large families. And the comparison to Europe makes it impossible to claim this is just a Minnesota problem. In the UK, Somali-born women had a 9.6% employment rate in 2008, essentially near zero, and Somali men sat around 40%. Fast forward, and the 2021 census still shows unemployment more than double the national average, and an inactivity rate of 47%, meaning nearly half of working-age Somalis are not in the labour market at all. Now, before we get to the next part, if you're enjoying this video so far, please remember to give the video a like, subscribe if you haven't already, and consider signing up on Patreon, which comes with a ton of perks. The welfare data is just as bleak. In Minnesota, it is estimated that over 70% of Somali households rely on some sort of public assistance: SNAP, Section 8, Medicaid, public housing, or other state benefits. The Office of Refugee Resettlement has repeatedly noted that Somali refugees, particularly women, have among the lowest employment rates of any refugee group in the United States. And because Somali families tend to be larger, the ratio of earners to dependents is even lower, increasing welfare usage further. This isn't unique to America either. In Sweden, Somali men had an employment rate of just 27% and women 13%. In Norway, only 42.7% of Somali immigrants were working, compared to nearly 74% of the general population. In the Netherlands, unemployment among Somalis hit 34%, the highest of any immigrant group, and even those who did work were mainly low-wage, temporary jobs that paid barely more than welfare. So across the board, the US, the UK, Scandinavia, the Netherlands, the pattern doesn't change. And when you put all these numbers together, the economic picture paints in one direction. Somali immigration has been a significant net fiscal cost for host countries, especially in the first generation. The US doesn't publish ethnicity-specific tax and transfer balances, but the indicators we do have make the conclusion hard to avoid. Very little tax revenue coming in, and a lot of public spending going out. Minnesota, home to the largest Somali population, illustrates the scale. When 35 to 40% of a community lives below the poverty line, and nearly half of working-age adults are either unemployed or inactive, that automatically means tens of thousands of households qualify for multiple layers of assistance at once. European data makes the picture even sharper because governments there actually calculate lifetime fiscal impacts. The Netherlands found that first-generation asylum migrants from Somalia and nearby countries have a lifetime net cost of negative 400,000 euros per person. Denmark's figures are similar. The US system is less generous than Scandinavia's, but even a modest net cost, say $10,000 per person per year, becomes enormous when applied to a large Somalian population. We're talking billions of dollars. And speaking of costs, talking about topics like this today are becoming harder, with many Western governments cracking down on free speech online. That's exactly why I use Proton VPN and why I think you should too. They're based in Switzerland, outside the reach of US, EU, UK and Australian law. They don't keep logs and are built by the same team behind Proton Mail. When the UK passed its surveillance laws, Proton VPN became the #1 app on the App Store. Their stealth protocol beats censorship firewalls. Secure Core routes your traffic through privacy-first countries, and NetShield blocks trackers before they ever reach you. I've used Proton Mail since Australia announced sweeping surveillance laws last year, and I'm not exaggerating when I say it's now essential. If you want to protect your privacy and support this channel, hit the link below to get up to 60% off Proton VPN. If the economic numbers paint a worrying picture, the fraud stories take it to another level entirely. Because once these communities become established, Minnesota and eventually the federal government discovered something far more serious: massive, organized exploitation of welfare programs, some of it on a scale that stunned investigators. The first big explosion was the daycare scandal. In 2018, Fox 9 revealed that up to $100 million a year was being drained out of Minnesota's subsidized childcare program, with many of the implicated centers run by Somalis. These weren't minor billing errors. Kids who never attended were billed as full-time. Centers claimed hours they never provided, and then the money moved, often out of the country via hawalas. Minnesota law enforcement openly warned that some of these funds were likely ending up in Somalia and possibly reaching Al-Shabaab. Then came the $250 million Feeding Our Future scandal, the biggest pandemic fraud in Minnesota and one of the largest in US history. Dozens of Somali American defendants were indicted for inventing meal sites, forging rosters of hungry children, and stealing federal child nutrition funds to buy luxury cars, jewelry, and overseas real estate. And it wasn't just Minnesota. Somali families in Maine falsely claimed disability payments. In Europe, Somalis in Norway fraudulently claimed benefits for children who didn't even live in the country. The same patterns repeated everywhere. And what many people don't realize is this: the fraud didn't start after arrival. It began during the immigration process itself. In 2008, the US government DNA tested Somali applicants in the Priority 3 Family Reunification Program. The results were explosive. Around 80% of the claimed family relationships were fake. Only about 1 in 5 matched the sponsor. That level of deception forced the US to shut down the entire African P3 program for years. Officials described the fraud rates as serious evidence of program abuse. Many Somalis had claimed unrelated children or distant clan members as immediate family, and some weren't Somali at all. Europe found the same thing. Norway and the UK repeatedly caught Somali applicants using fake identities, multiple aliases, all claiming false family ties. Several Somalis even had their citizenship revoked after authorities discovered they lied about their nationality. Now, not only are the Somali communities in the West a net fiscal cost, but billions of Western dollars are being siphoned right back out. propping up the economy of a foreign state more than America's own. Somalia is one of the most remittance-dependent nations on Earth. Every year, the global Somali diaspora sends home somewhere between $1.3 and $2 billion, and the US accounts for a massive share of that. To put that into perspective, remittances make up almost 50% of Somalia's entire GDP. That means one thing very clearly. The United States is effectively subsidizing another country's economic survival, a country that hasn't had functional institutions for decades and that still battles terrorism, clan conflict, and total state dysfunction. Minnesota alone sends hundreds of millions every year through Hawala storefronts, often clustered right in the same neighborhoods with the lowest employment and the highest welfare dependence. So American taxpayers foot the bill twice, once through welfare and again when the money leaves the country entirely. Oddly enough, the only people clearly benefiting from mass Somali resettlement in the US are the organizations paid to bring them in. And ironically, these are overwhelmingly Christian refugee agencies importing overwhelmingly Muslim populations into American towns, despite the massive cultural mismatch and all the downstream problems we have just gone through. The US refugee system is run through a network of government-funded voluntary agencies, mostly religious: Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service, the US Conference of Catholic Bishops, Church World Service, and others. These groups are effectively contractors for the federal government. For every refugee they resettle, they receive roughly $2,300 in federal funding, plus additional grants for integration support. The more arrivals they process, the more money and staffing they secure. When refugee admissions fall, like during Trump's cuts, these agencies panic, lay off staff, and lobby aggressively to restore higher numbers. They have a built-in financial incentive to keep the pipeline full. It truly is odd. Christian churches importing large numbers of Muslim migrants whose culture clashes dramatically with Western norms, while the churches themselves never bear the long-term costs. After 90 days, their contractual responsibility ends. The financial strain, crime spikes, school burdens, and welfare pressure fall entirely on local communities, not on the agencies that push for these arrivals. Today, we're seeing claims that Somalis built America, or that they have always been in America. It's an absurd rewriting of history. Somali migration to the US didn't meaningfully begin until the 1990s. The data I just shared with you, in fact, all point in the same direction, and none of it reflects a group that has been quietly holding up American civilization. In fact, the American and other Western governments are entirely justified, morally and politically, in drastically curbing Somali immigration or attaching extremely stringent conditions to it. Immigration policy is not holy scripture. It's a policy like any other, and it has to be judged by outcomes, not sentiment. The outcomes here are overwhelmingly negative. No country has a moral duty to continue importing population that, in aggregate, struggles to integrate and imposes long-term economic and social costs.
In the neon haze of a broken dawn, steel towers hum, but the wild runs on.